Hi everyone and welcome to this week's online lecture, which is entitled Words, Words, Words. And really the point of this is to recognise that you have been learning and hearing lots of new words, terms, concepts, and what I want to start to do this week is really be a bit clearer about what some of those mean, how they relate to each other, and therefore so we can be a bit more deliberate in the way that we use them. So some of the ones you've been talking about and we've used in different ways, and we've talked about some of these more than others, are occupation, role, task, movement, activity, action, and there are lots more. But these are mainly the ones I want to focus on today. So this is feeding into that taxonomy of occupation idea that we have mentioned previously, and this is the idea that there are ways of categorizing occupation. And it's worth having a look at the chapter you've been asked to read, the Harvey and Pentland chapter for this week, which includes some new ways of categorizing occupation. So, for example, into necessary occupations, contracted occupations, committed occupations, and free time occupations. But then they also go on to introduce some other terms, and they're the ones I'd like to focus a bit more on, particularly in this lecture. So this is essentially about trying to put some language and understanding around occupation and the other things, in inverted commas deliberately, that we've been thinking and talking a bit about. So in the Harvey and Pentland book, they distinguish between roles, occupations, activities, and tasks. And these are the things I want us to think about a bit more. Role, in the way it's used in this book, is, as it says in the chapter, a pattern of behaviour that involves certain rights and duties that an individual is expected, trained, and often encouraged to perform in a particular social situation. Okay? So I guess some of the important points here are that a role is generally recognised within a particular social group or a particular context, to use some of the language we've been using already, and also that it involves certain rights and duties, and there are certain expectations in terms of what that involves, and here it's termed a pattern of behaviour. We know what occupations are, and the argument in the Harvey and Pentland book, and one I'd like us to think about, is that in order to fulfil a role, an individual engages in a number of occupations. So one role requires numerous occupations, or numerous occupations contribute to make up a role that somebody is fulfilling. Activities then and tasks are generally, there's no easy explanation, but are generally smaller and smaller bits of occupations that lead into roles. And you could even go smaller, and some of the taxonomies that have been published do go smaller, right down to individual movements of joints, body parts, and also cognitive processes that go on. But for the time being, I just want us to think about these four different types or four components. The example they give in the book, I think, is really interesting because I think it clearly demonstrates all of those things. So first of all, the role is father, mother, carer. It could be a whole range of other things as well. The occupation, in this particular case, in the example they give in the book, is cooking breakfast. One of the activities involved in cooking breakfast in this particular situation is boiling eggs. And the tasks involved in boiling eggs are required to turn on the stove, fill the pan with water, take an egg out of the egg case or the egg holder in the fridge, whatever, put the egg in the pan, and there are a whole range of other tasks as well. I think this example is really interesting for a number of reasons, because if you go up, you can see how all of those things fit in, but also if you started to come down and think about, well, what are the occupations involved in being a father, mother, or carer? Cooking breakfast is only one of those occupations, which highlights the point I made earlier. So some of the other occupations might be doing the laundry, driving children to school, it might be paying the bills, it could be a whole range of things. Similarly, cooking breakfast requires more activities than boiling eggs, because presumably people are drinking something with breakfast. They might be having toast or something else with their eggs. And as I just said before, boiling eggs requires more than turning on the stove, filling the pan with water. I think it's useful to think about these things in terms of these Russian nesting dolls, babushka dolls, I think they're called, so that you start from the right-hand side, a number of tasks are required to complete an activity. A number of activities are required to complete an occupation, and a number of occupations are required to complete roles. And so I think that's a useful way of thinking about it. I think this is also really important because it also gives us a bit more guidance in terms of where is the focus of occupational therapy. The focus of occupational therapy is around occupations, and so while we need to be aware of everything to the left of that, in this case roles, and to the right of that activities and tasks, we only need to understand those in so much as they help us understand the occupation somebody needs to engage, wants, or has to engage in. And so I think this is really useful in terms of the focus of occupational therapy. The focus of occupational therapy is on occupations, but we might need to think about the other things depending on what's going on for the individual that we're working with. I think this is really important. It might seem a bit pedantic, but actually I think it's really important because the language that we use and the terminology that we use as occupational therapists is very important. And it's important in terms of the communication we have between ourselves, but also the communication that we have between ourselves, our clients, but also the people that we work with in terms of other health and social care professionals. And I also think it's worth thinking about in terms of the whole idea that there are differences between occupations, activities, tasks, movements, etc. And often in occupational therapy, we use those terms interchangeably. And sometimes that's very deliberate because of the audience we're talking to. But I also think it's really important for us to start being much more precise about the terms we're using, because as you've just seen and as you've read in the book chapter, in the literature, these things are different. And so I think we need to start being very clear about that.